A textbook can only provide a sliver of the content and activities you need to learn Chinese, but rather than throwing your textbook away, try using several of them in parallel. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue talking about something that I mentioned last week when we talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands and how to use those to analyze and balance your Chinese learning. I basically said that if you follow a standard curriculum or use a standard textbook, most of the activities that you do actually fall into one of Paul Nation's 4 strands, meaning that there are 3 strands that are largely left uncovered, and that is not a good thing. To recap briefly what we talked about last week, there is meaning-focused input, that's the first strand, then we have meaning-focused output, that's the second strand, and both of these rely on using language that is largely known to you, about 95% or more. And if we analyze the texts that occur in most standard textbooks, we will see that they contain a lot more new content. So for example, if we assume that a sentence is 10 words long, which would be rather long on average for a beginner textbook, but still, we should then only expect to have 1 new word in every other sentence. And anybody who has studied a normal textbook knows that that is not the case. We typically have maybe more than 1 word per sentence that we're not familiar with, and sometimes there's also grammar and so on and so forth. The point is that the texts don't count as meaning-focused input. Most of the exercises in textbooks don't count as meaning-focused output either, but that is a separate topic that I will talk about some other day. It goes without saying that if there is too much new content for it to count as meaning-focused input, there's definitely too much content to count it as fluency development, where you're supposed to use or encounter language that you already know. There's not supposed to be anything new, and if there is something new, it should be something very small that is easy to figure out anyway. So some textbooks do have this. For example, at the end of a unit, there might be several chapters baked together into one text where they kind of recycle the words, use the same grammar patterns and so on, but they are now telling a new story with a new setting and so on, but without throwing in too much new language. This would count as fluency development, or if there's a slightly more new vocabulary, it would count as meaning-focused input. But these texts are rather rare. We maybe have a handful in a textbook, if there are any such texts at all. So this means that the activities that textbooks promote and the activities we indeed see in many traditional classrooms are all categorized as language-focused learning, and that's just one of the strands, and yet we spend almost all our time doing that. And that was kind of the point last week, that there are so many other things that we should do. However, I also acknowledge the difficulty as a beginner to find materials to study that will count as fluency development or meaning-focused input. And of course, if you have a teacher who can tailor their output to meet your needs, or if you have someone who's good at talking to you on your level, then that's great, but most people don't have that, so it is still a problem that needs to be solved. And most commercial material here, if you're going for graded readers and things like that, they start being useful when you already know a few hundred characters. There are no graded readers written for people who know 10 characters or 20. But if you get up to 150 or 300, then there's plenty of content out there. The same goes for listening as well, so most podcasts out there for beginners still focus on teaching you a lot of new words, so by definition that is not meaning-focused input, and it's definitely not fluency development. There is a rather simple workaround though that works very well and doesn't require you to have a personal tutor. Like I said in the introduction, one textbook cannot really provide you with what you need, but actually if you use more than one textbook, things start looking a bit better. Before I explain how this works and how you can use it to improve your own Chinese, I'd like to say a few words about why I'm still talking about textbooks, because, well, if they aren't good, shouldn't we just throw them away? And, well, you can do that, but it also puts an enormous burden on you to find other learning content. And again, if you have a teacher who can spoon-feed you the Chinese you need, this is not really an issue, but for most independent students and people who are limited in terms of being able to hire teachers and so on, this really is a problem. So I do think there is good reason to use textbooks. The most important reason is that textbooks contain language that is very useful for you as a student and is also high frequency. And these are often the same thing, but not always. There are some words that are very useful for students, but might not be extremely high frequency in the language itself. And of course, there are some words that Chinese people use all the time, especially in written language, that aren't very suitable for beginners. And textbooks kind of hit the sweet spot here. They present language that is both high frequency and useful for you as a student. This advantage is most pronounced when you first start out, and the more advanced the textbook is, the less likely it is to actually be something you want to learn, and the more likely it is that you're just better off reading and listening to things that you're interested in. The second advantage of using textbooks is that they do explain some things that can be good to know. And I'm not saying that you should spend all your time learning about Chinese rather than actually learning the language, but I do think that some explicit instruction, i.e. understanding, for example, what tones are, how they work, or some basic things about grammar, learning about how characters are structured and so on, can be very beneficial for us adults when we learn a foreign language, especially a foreign language that is so different from, say, English as Chinese is. Like I said earlier though, if your learning mostly consists of following a textbook series, you will get way too much of this type of learning. I'm just pointing out here that this type of learning itself is useful if used moderately. This is something I have written about on Hacking Chinese in the article Learn Chinese Implicitly Through Exposure with a Seasoning of Explicit Instruction, and I've put a link in the description. Okay, so let's discuss this idea of having more than one textbook, because you might argue that, okay, if using one textbook is bad because it doesn't cover what I need, using more textbooks, doesn't that just make the problem worse? No, it doesn't, depending on how you're using these extra textbooks, which is what I will talk about now. Here's a method that works and is easy to implement. I've used it many times myself, and I've also applied it with students. First, pick a textbook as your primary textbook, and this should be a textbook you think is good at explaining things and that kind of gives you the material you need to understand what's going on, including basic introductions to grammar, pronunciation, characters, and so on. If you're enrolled in a course, this is probably the book that your teacher has chosen. So, assuming that you're a beginner, you start with the first 3 chapters in your primary textbook. Then you put it away, and you pick up your secondary textbook and study 3 chapters there as well. Then you pick up your third textbook and you study another 3 chapters in that one. So for all these, you're studying chapters 1, 2, and 3. You're not advancing in the textbook or anything. You're just studying the first 3 chapters in each book. The point here is that when you study your first textbook, everything will be new to you, and it's nice to have instructions and some explanations of what's going on. Then, when you get to the second textbook, even though textbooks are of course different, they are not that different and they do tend to cover the same stuff, especially for beginners. You're probably not going to get to 95% familiarity in your second textbook, maybe you will get to 50% or something like that. Then in your third textbook you might get to 75%, and in your fourth textbook you do hit 95% and you kind of understand what's going on without actually looking anything up and there are no new words. This is especially true for chapter 1, which tends to include greetings and basic pronouns and so on, and those are largely the same across different textbooks. Naturally, there's nothing that says you have to stop at 4 textbooks. You can use 5 or 12 or 29 or however many textbooks you have available. But the point is that this is a great way of accessing content on your level using the very limited vocabulary that you have to understand something written in Chinese. And obviously this works for listening as well, provided that the textbook has audio. Since you are staying at the same level, you're doing chapters 1, 2, 3 in all of these books, the level doesn't increase and the texts don't become much more difficult, so after a while you will be able to reach a level where you can read these things and also pick up the extra words you might encounter. When you've done this with chapters 1 to 3, you can go on to do it with chapters 4 to 6, or however you want to chop up the content. Naturally, I just arbitrarily chose a number of chapters here and I said 1, 2, 3. You might want to do 1 chapter at a time in each book, or you might want to do 10 chapters. I don't know, it depends on the level of the textbook and the level of your Chinese. Because like I said, the more advanced your Chinese gets, the less overlap there will be between textbooks, and it makes more sense then to maybe cover more chapters before you move to the next textbook. Feel free to experiment and see what works for you, but in my experience when I've used this in teaching, I think using roughly 3 chapters is about right. I think a practical question will have occurred to most of you here, and that is which textbooks to use. But like I said, I don't think that matters much. The first textbook is more important because that's where you will get your explanations and your instructions from. But for the other textbooks, the only thing that matters is that they have audio and that they have texts that are more or less interesting. And there are limits to how interesting you can write something when you have 10 characters at your disposal, but don't hesitate to throw something away if you don't like it. Do make sure that the textbooks you use have audio though, so you can replicate this method for listening as well. If you want some concrete suggestions for textbooks, I did write a little bit about that in the article The 7 Best Chinese Reading Resources for Beginners, and I'll put a link in the description. Next, let's talk about how using more than one textbook can be useful for intermediate learners as well. This is not just something I recommend for beginners. The reasoning here is slightly different because there's much less overlap in intermediate textbooks, so you can't really count on having the same content appear over and over again. But this is also part of the point because it will enable you to solidify your foundation, which will be necessary if you want to reach an advanced level. To show you what I mean, let's look at what happens when people follow a single textbook series, usually in a language course or in a language school in China maybe, or in some kind of setting where it's very important to get through a certain textbook series. And I've seen this many times with students, and I've also encountered this myself personally when I learned Chinese. So what happens if you stay within the confines of a given textbook series is that the authors, of course, know exactly what they have taught in earlier chapters, and they will recycle that vocabulary, which is great. This enables you to learn that vocabulary better and so on. But they will also make the language fairly advanced way too quickly. So for example, it's possible to cover maybe 2 textbooks per semester if you study full-time, or maybe 1 if you're not studying full-time. But that means that you can get to book 5 in a textbook series in your second year of learning Chinese. And if you are not doing a lot of studying on the side, this will not enable you to actually be an advanced learner. But if you look at the texts included in the final book in many standard textbook series, these are rather advanced, and there are many constructions and words in here that look like you'd be an advanced learner. And you might even feel like you're an advanced learner. I mean, you're reading these texts, you're talking about them in class and so on. Now, the problem is that you have a very narrow but advanced Chinese. It essentially means that you can manage these texts only because the textbook authors have spent the previous 4 books preparing for that specific text. If you were to approach another text, which on the surface is equally difficult or would appear equally difficult for an outside observer, that uses similarly difficult words, difficult grammar and concepts and so on, you'd probably have no chance whatsoever to understand anything in it. And this is very common when you have people who have studied Chinese in class a lot and haven't studied it outside class, and they are reading about something fairly advanced in class, and then they have a normal conversation and they don't understand anything. Or they read a text that is rather simple, it just happens to be about something they haven't covered in class, and they won't understand the text, even if it's much simpler, actually from an objective point of view, than the text that they are covering in their textbook. This is something I called the illusion of advanced learning, and I think it's very prevalent in many language schools where there is a pressure to get further and further in a textbook series, and getting to a certain book is equivalent to being at a certain level of Chinese. And for anybody who has tried to use their Chinese outside the classroom, you know that this is pure nonsense. Having reached a certain textbook doesn't mean anything in terms of what you can do with a language. Did you actually learn everything in the textbook? Have you learned other things on the same level, or did you just learn exactly what was in the textbook, and so on? Considering what the topic is for this episode, I think it should be fairly obvious what one of the solutions might be here, and that is, instead of using more and more advanced textbooks, you use more than one textbook, and you stay on, say, textbook 3, but you use different series of textbooks. So instead of trying to get to these artificially advanced level of Chinese, you just accept that, yeah, this will take some time. There are many ways of talking about these things, and there are many topics they didn't cover. A simple example might be something like sports or hobbies. So in one textbook, they go play baseball because this is for American college students and they care about baseball. But in another textbook, they might do some other sport or practice some hobby or something else. The point is that there are many topics to cover within a certain area, and in one textbook series they will typically choose 1 or 2 and then move on. And you can say the same thing for food or for travel or for anything else really. And by using more than one textbook, you can then cover more of these topics, leading to a broader and more solid Chinese. Another way to look at this is to do a frequency analysis of the vocabulary included in a textbook series. And then we will of course see that in books 1 and 2, very high frequency words are used, and these are things you should definitely learn. But then when you get to books 4 and 5, there will be lots of words in there that aren't that common. And there's a vast number of more common words you just haven't learned yet. But somehow the authors feel that they have to make things more advanced and you have to get further more quickly. So they skip over all this, which results in this illusion of advanced learning. To be fair, it could be argued that textbook authors are not to blame here. They are, after all, providing some kind of structured approach that gets more and more advanced, and there is nothing wrong with that in itself. The actual problem is with people who think that getting further in a textbook series is equal to learning more and better Chinese, and that is simply wrong. Which leads us to the last thing I want to talk about in today's episode, and that is, of course, that Chinese learning shouldn't be limited to textbooks. Well, this was the topic of this episode, and I did bring up a few advantages with using textbooks, but when you get to the intermediate level, there are so many other resources out there that you should also use, of course. As soon as you have reached the level where you can listen to some podcasts, where you can read graded readers and so on, without having to resort to looking at the word lists all the time, then you should do so as much as possible all the time, and you don't have to spend that much time with textbooks. Like I said, this is very difficult for beginners because there simply isn't that much graded content out there if you know almost nothing, but for intermediate learners there really is no good excuse to not read and listen a lot outside of your textbook. And of course, if you've found enough content to read and listen to on your own, or if you have a teacher who has provided it for you, feel free to throw out your textbook. It doesn't really help you all that much, even though I do think that using textbooks can be very useful, especially if you use more than one in parallel. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.